place you live will never feel like home if you've got bad interior design. But if you're new to design, you may not be able to tell whether your place is designed poorly or not. So in this video, I'm going to show you 5 things even a total beginner can identify that immediately signal bad design. And if you stick around until the end, I'll also show you how to fix these 5 problems so you can finally make your place feel like home. So the first thing that usually gives away a poorly designed room is how it uses color, or more specifically, how it doesn't use it. Because most people are terrified of making a mistake, so they end up playing it safe by painting everything the same neutral tone. And we've all seen these rooms. The walls are beige, the sofa's beige, and the carpet is beige. And while it feels like an easy choice, it's actually a trap, because when everything in a room is the same color and brightness, it just feels flat. You know, it's like looking at a photo that's been overexposed in the sun. There's no depth, no shadow, and just nowhere for your eye to rest. And the reason this feels so uninspiring is actually biological. Our eyes are naturally designed to look for edges and contrast, to understand where one object ends and another begins. But when everything is the same shade, your brain gets visual fatigue. It stops processing the room as a design space and starts seeing it as a blur of background noise. And this is why these rooms never feel like a cozy retreat. They just feel empty and unfinished. And a quick way to see if your room has this problem is to walk into it and squint your eyes until everything gets blurry. Because in a great room, you'll still see a dark shape, like a fireplace or a dark sofa, which stands out against the lighter wall. But if you squint and the whole room just turns into one big indistinct blob, then you've played it too safe. So to fix this, you have to understand how different surfaces handle light, because every material exists on a continuum where on one end, it bounces all the light back at you, and at the other end, it soaks all the light up. And so a bright white wall reflects almost all the light that hits it, while a dark wooden cabinet or a black metal lamp soaks up most of that light. And so the safe room feels boring because every single thing, the walls, the rug, and the curtains, is bouncing back the exact same amount of light. So to make your room feel three-dimensional, you need a mix. You need some dark anchors that soak up the light, like a deep tone chair or some dark wood floors. And then you also need some lighter tones that reflect the light, like cream walls or white sheer curtains. Because when you have that contrast, both types of surfaces look crisp and intentional instead of just blank. So one good way to think about this is the 60-30-10 rule. You want about 60% of the room to be your main canvas color. So this is usually your walls, but it could also be another large surface like the cabinets in your kitchen. And then 30% should be a different shade or a variation of that color. So that might be your rug or your curtains, which provides a bit of a soft contrast. And then the final 10% should be a bolder, darker, or riskier accent color. So this is the pop of black metal, the dark forest green pillow, or that brass lamp. And that 10% is really important because without it, the 60% and 30% have no context and they just bleed together. But beyond that, when you ignore contrast like this and just go 100% neutral, you aren't actually playing it safe. You're just creating a room that's institutional and lifeless. You've created a space that looks like a 2-star lounge at a mid-tier airport. It's designed to be so inoffensive that it just disappears entirely. But you want your home to do the opposite. It should invite the eye to stay, explore, and to rest. So if your room is feeling like a lifeless blob, the fix isn't necessarily to paint a bright red accent wall. It's just to introduce a little bit of contrast. Because by adding those deep, dark anchors and the crisp highlights, you give the room a pulse. You turn your flat beige box into a 3-dimensional environment that feels intentional, high-end, and most importantly, alive. And by the way, if you want to see how your own home would look after making some of the changes I'm talking about, I've developed some tools to help you with exactly that. For example, if you're on a budget and you only want to upgrade the lighting in your home, one of my tools will show you exactly how to go from a dining room that looks harsh and overwhelming like this to one that looks soft and inviting like this, just by changing the lighting. Of course, the tools can do way more than that, but I just wanted to give you a very small sneak peek now. So if you want to get full access to them, check out the link in the description. Now, after color, the next thing that usually makes a room feel off is the layout. And it often comes down to one thing: too much symmetry. Because when people aren't sure how to design their home, they tend to buy everything in pairs. And we've all seen this before. 2 matching sofas facing each other, 2 identical side tables holding 2 identical lamps, and matching pillows on each side of the bed. And it feels safe because it's orderly and almost impossible to mess up, but it's also the quickest way to make your home feel like a furniture store catalog. Because a real home that feels lived in and comfortable, that happens over time, not in a single afternoon at a showroom. But when everything is a perfect match, it can feel like you don't trust your own taste enough to let an object stand on its own. And the problem with this Noah's Ark approach to design is that it makes your room feel super stiff. Your brain walks into the room, acknowledges the symmetry, and solves the space in half a second. And because there's no surprise or variety, your eye stops moving and the room starts to feel cold, like a hotel lobby where you're not really supposed to sit down or get comfortable. So what you want instead is a sense of balance that isn't a mirror image. So think of it like a seesaw. You can balance a 200-pound person on one side with 2 100-pound kids on the other side, or with one kid sitting further away. And interior design operates on this same principle of visual weight, which is a measure of how much visual real estate an object occupies in your mind. For example, a large, dark velvet sofa has tons of visual weight because its color is dense, its texture is rich, and its physical footprint is large. And so it pulls the gravity toward that side of the room. So if you were to put another identical sofa across from it, you'd have a room that feels a little bit like a barbell at the gym. It's balanced, but it's also exhausting. So instead, you should aim to create balance through distribution, because you can offset that heavy sofa by grouping a cluster of lighter, more varied elements on the opposite side. So in this case, that might mean a sleek, open-legged accent chair which allows light to pass under it, a tall, thin floor lamp which adds some vertical height, and a leafy plant which adds an organic, airy texture to the room. And something like this would work because your brain adds up the total attention that it's allocating to those smaller items. And so the chair provides the mass, the lamp provides the height, and the plant provides a bit of movement. And together, they create a visual counterweight that's equal in interest to the sofa, even though they're physically much smaller. And so this approach creates a layout that feels right, but also feels human, because it invites the eye to wander and discover things rather than just scanning a predictable, boring grid. It changes the room from a static photo into a dynamic environment. Plus, that intentional break in the symmetry is where the soul of the room lives. It's a visual nod that says, here lives a person with taste, not a computer. Because by breaking the symmetry, you create visual interest, which is the difference between someone walking into your room and saying, yeah, this is nice, versus them saying, I never want to leave this place. And so when you master this asymmetrical balance, you start looking at objects for their weight rather than their twin. And this allows you to mix styles, eras, and scales without the room feeling like a mess. Plus, it creates a sense of harmony that's much more sophisticated than a simple mirror image. So if you walk into a room and it feels like you're standing in front of a mirror, that's your cue that the design is playing it too safe. Because great design is about the balance of opposites, the heavy and the light, and the matched and the mismatched. So we've talked about color and layout, but there's a third red flag that's much harder to photograph, but impossible to ignore once you're actually in the room. And I call it the size gap. And you know the feeling. You walk into a house that looks like $1 million on Instagram with these soaring 20-foot ceilings and massive open concept rooms, but within 5 minutes, you feel strangely exposed. You find yourself hovering near a wall or sitting on the edge of your chair because you're unable to fully relax. Well, this happens because bad design often prioritizes how a room looks in a photo over how it feels to a human body. And when there's a broken relationship between the grand architecture of a house and the vulnerable reality of our biology, the room stops being a home and starts being a source of stress. Let me explain. Our brains are hardwired to crave shelter, and that's the feeling of being protected from behind and covered from above. But when a room is excessively large without any mid-level breaks, it loses that sense of security. And then it doesn't feel like you're in a living room, because psychologically, you're standing in the middle of a vast open field during a storm. You're vulnerable. And so while a 20-foot ceiling might look impressive, in reality, it creates a vertical vacuum. And without anything to bring that scale back down to your eye level, the space feels institutional and cold. You aren't living in a room, you're rattling around in an airplane hangar that's too big for the human spirit to fill. So to fix this, you have to create an invisible boundary that defines where the actual living happens. Or in other words, you need to introduce visual horizons. By making changes like painting the bottom 2/3 of a wall a deeper tone, you tell your brain the architecture is up there, but the home is down here. And to ground a massive space even more, you'll want to choose furniture that has some gravity to it. So in a cathedral-sized room, delicate, spindly furniture is your enemy because a thin-legged chair makes you feel like you're floating on a raft in the middle of an ocean. Instead, you need deep, low-slung sofas to provide protection and oversized rugs to act as landing pads that physically define the borders of the space. But the size gap also exists at the opposite end of the spectrum, where your ceiling is so low that you feel boxed in. And so in these tighter spaces, the strategy flips from grounding the room to vertical expansion. And so the goal here is to remove the horizontal interruptions that remind your brain where the room ends. And so you can achieve this by hanging your curtains at the very top of the wall, almost touching the ceiling and letting them fall all the way down to the floor. This creates an uninterrupted vertical line that tricks the brain into believing that there's more air above your head than there actually is. And tall, narrow bookcases do this really well as well. They pull your attention upward instead of outward, which makes the ceiling feel higher than it actually is. And then keeping furniture low to the ground also helps because the more empty wall you leave above eye level, the taller the room feels. So, as a general rule, if your room is extremely tall and you want it to look more cozy and intimate, you want to use horizontal line. And if your room is short or feels compressed, you do the opposite. You emphasize vertical lines to stretch the space upward and give your brain a sense of breathing room. But once you understand the size gap, you stop chasing rooms that just look impressive and start designing spaces that actually feel good to live in. And when the scale of the room finally matches the human scale, the space stops demanding your attention and starts giving you something back, a calm, comfortable place where you can finally exhale. Now, the next red flag is something you don't even have to look at to notice because you just feel it on your skin. And I call it the sensory dead zone. We've all walked into a home that feels less like a residence and more like the lobby of a tech company. Everything's perfectly smooth, perfectly shiny, and perfectly sterile. And this happens when a room is filled with materials that are too similar. Because when you remove the friction from a room, you also remove the soul. And you end up creating a plastic atmosphere where your eyes and your hands just never find a place to rest. And when you lean into this style of slippery design, where every surface in the room is hard and non-porous, like a glass coffee table with a leather sofa and polished tile floors, the room just feels cold. And that's because there's no visual grip. But on the other hand, in a room with well thought out textures, your eyes can actually hold on to the grain of the wood or the weave of a fabric, which helps you sense the depth of the space. But in a slippery room, your gaze just glides off the surfaces. It feels artificial and manufactured, which keeps your brain in a state of low-level alertness instead of allowing you to relax. So to fix this, you want to balance the temperatures of your materials. And to be clear, this isn't about the thermostat. It's about how warm or cold a material feels to the touch. Because a space only feels right when it reaches a balance. So if you have cold materials like metal, glass, or stone, you'll want to consciously balance them with warm materials like wood, wool, linen, or velvet. So if you have a sleek leather sofa, it looks high-end, but its frequency is cold. And so to balance out that coldness, you need some counter friction. So something like the earthy, nubby texture of a jute rug or the softness of a chunky knit throw. And one of the reasons texture has such a big impact is because it creates micro shadows. And this is a concept that a lot of people miss, but texture is really just a collection of thousands of tiny shadows. Because when light hits a flat plastic surface, it just bounces completely off it. But when light hits a woven basket or a piece of raw wood, it creates a million tiny highlights and shadows. And these shadows are the data points your brain uses to perceive that a room is real and high quality. And this is why expensive homes often feature rough elements like stone walls and reclaimed beams, because they're using the rough to make the smooth surfaces look more intentional. So to get this right, You can use the rule of 3 textures, which is a helpful guideline for introducing texture into your home. For every room, you should be able to identify 3 levels of grit. First, your foundation, which is generally smooth walls and floors. Second, your support, which is the medium grain of wood furniture or leather. And then third is your accent, which is the high friction punch of a wool rug, a velvet pillow, or a ceramic vase. And so if your room feels cheap or plasticky, it's likely because you've stayed at level 1. So by layering these materials and textures on top of each other, you move the room away from that plasticky feel and toward being a multi-sensory experience. Because you want the cool, crisp touch of a marble countertop to be warmed up by the organic grain of a wooden cutting board. Because bad design is too consistent and too smooth. But good design has friction. It's the intentional collision of the rough, the soft, the cold, and the warm. And it's the difference between a room you simply look at and a room that makes you want to reach out and touch it. Now, the final thing to look for is something most of us do without realizing it, which is we buy everything in the same shape. And if you look around at a typical living room, almost every major piece of furniture is a rectangle or a square, right? The sofa is a long rectangle, the rug is just a giant rectangle, the TV stand is a rectangle, and the windows and bookshelves are just sharp rectangles. But when a room is filled with nothing but these hard 90-degree angles, the space starts to feel incredibly stiff. And this is one of the main reasons a room can look correct, but still feel like the waiting room in a doctor's office. Because your brain picks up on all those sharp corners and interprets your environment as formal and rigid, which is not the vibe that most of us are going for in our homes. So to fix this, you have to intentionally break up those straight lines with softer, rounded shapes. Now, this doesn't mean you need to go out and buy a circular sofa, but it does mean that you should at least consider introducing some items that don't have such sharp corners. Because when you place a round coffee table in the middle of a boxy seating area, it completely changes the energy of the room because it gives your eye a place to rest that isn't a sharp point. And so instead of your gaze hitting the corner and stopping, it follows the smooth edges of that circle. And this variety is what makes a room feel like a home rather than a furniture store. And it also creates a sense of balance because you're mixing the strength of the straight lines with the softness of the curves. And you can easily test this in your own home by standing in the doorway and looking for the lines. If everything looks like a grid, like a top-down view of Manhattan on Google Maps, your room is going to feel cold. But all you need to do to solve this is look for opportunities to swap a square for a circle. So if you have an angular dresser in your bedroom, which you probably do, try hanging a round mirror above it instead of going with a rectangular one. And if your dining table is a long rectangle, which it almost certainly is, then look for chairs with rounded backs or for a nice circular bowl that you can place in the center of it. And even small changes, like a round pillow on a square chair or a circular rug under an armchair, these can soften the entire room. Because by mixing these shapes, you're making the room feel more natural and approachable, because nature doesn't work in perfect 90-degree angles. So if you zoom out, all 5 of these mistakes are kind of the same mistake. You're treating your room like a picture instead of a physical environment. Because when a space goes too neutral, too symmetrical, too oversized, too smooth, or too boxy, it isn't just boring, it's unreadable. Your brain can't find edges, can't find shelter, can't find warmth, and can't find a rhythm to follow. And when a room becomes hard to read, your body can't relax, and it's forced to always stay slightly on guard. That's why bad design doesn't just look off, it feels off. Because the goal of interior design is not to impress your eyes for 3 seconds. The goal is to support your nervous system for 3 hours, or more accurately, 3 generations. But the good news is, you don't need some inherent level of taste to fix that. You just need to start designing for contrast and comfort instead of safety and symmetry, just like I've shown you here. And once you start thinking in those terms, you stop shopping randomly and start making decisions like a designer. So you aren't asking yourself, do I like this item? But instead you're asking, what job does this solve in the room? Because you're not collecting furniture. You're building a system of cues that tells your brain that this is a safe space. And once you see design that way, you'll realize these 5 fixes are just the entry point. because the bigger challenge isn't spotting problem, it's knowing what to prioritize first so the room improves overnight without you buying 100 different things. So watch this video next where I'll teach you how to make a massive upgrade to your home in a single afternoon. This is one of the lowest hanging fruit opportunities in all of interior design, so you don't want to miss it.